A friend of mine, Alien Bob, you should check out their channel, by the way. They're a very good YouTuber in their own right. Left a very thoughtful and kind comment on my last video that went like this. I always appreciate how you're able to take subjects and people that are easy to dunk on or shitpost about, and I wouldn't blame anyone for doing so, and approach them in a nuanced and subtle and constructive way. Now, this was very nice, and I'm afraid I have to apologize to them because I am not going to be like this video. This video is me really making fun of someone who deserves it, because sometimes it's cathartic to point and laugh at someone who deserves it. When this video goes live, it will have been around a year since Liz Truss resigned as Prime Minister of the UK. Now, it was meant to be exactly a year, maybe it still is, but I, as you can probably tell from my voice, am still a tiny bit ill. And normally we mark the anniversary of events that matter, like when we marry our partners. Liz Truss, and I say this with 100% confidence, will not matter and will never matter. Her legacy is to be a trivia question. No one will think about her time as Prime Minister outside of very specialised political science research. That is a disgrace. Because I think, and maybe this is a controversial pitch, but I want you to stick with me, we didn't appreciate what we had when she was Prime Minister. She was the perfect distillation of Britain's political direction in the post-war era. She represented the level of exhaustion that her party had with governing and that the political class seems to have across party lines. She was the political equivalent of starting an essay at 3 AM the night before you had to hand it in. True perfection if you were trying to represent Britain. This woman's 49 days as Prime Minister, I think it's 49, it's sometimes 45 is when she resigned, but 49 is when she actually left office. The 49 days as Prime Minister represented so much for the short time that she was there. A true icon in the least complimentary way possible. So much happened in those 49 days that you wonder what the chances were that Britain's fastest flame out in office would occur at a time when so much was happening, and that it'd pour fuel into the fire of a lot of ongoing things. In case people need it explained, this is not a serious video, because forcing you to take the concept of Liz Truss seriously it isn't fair, and it's sort of impossible. The woman was defeated by a lettuce, for Christ's sake. So just sit back and enjoy this Halloween video replacement service, because I couldn't get what I needed for my original plans, so you'll just have to settle for Liz Truss. Which, I guess in the case of the Conservative Party, they kind of already did that, but now it's our turn. Okay, before we get into the video properly, I just want to say, if you're new here, definitely subscribe. If you're not new here and you're enjoying it so far, drop a like. This video is going to be very good, so you should definitely drop a like early and often. And, check out the Patreon. And I also have a Ko-fi now, because Patreon's being really weird, so go check that out and stuff. But anyway, onwards into the Liz Truss zone. Liz Truss exists on an island. No, not this one. She exists on an island in public opinion, a truly unique and beautiful figure in that realm. To give you an idea of just how isolated she is, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon, well, at least the first part of the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon, thanks to some fuckery by the Russian Emperor, ended up banished to the island of Elba and was allowed to retain his title of Emperor. Being banished to Elba was meant to be pretty isolating, but Napoleon came back during the 100 days, which are really 110 days, but, let's not think too much about that. And then he was banished to St. Helena, with Royal Navy ships patrolling around the island 24/7. Liz Truss is even more isolated than that. In fact, Napoleon's inevitably doomed, and I know I'm going to get some history nerds mad at me for saying that Napoleon was inevitably doomed, but he was, comeback actually lasted longer than Liz Truss's time as Prime Minister. She was more inherently doomed than Napoleon's comeback. I promise you I'm going somewhere with the Napoleon stuff, you just have to stick with me to get the payoff, but it's going to be worth it. Imagine a politician who says right-wing things, and then instead of at least 80% of the British press going out of their way to praise them, everyone without exception makes fun of them. God, imagine if they did that to all of them. Or imagine a senior politician who goes to Taiwan explicitly to support independence efforts, an action that China takes as a pretty inflammatory provocation, and they just don't really address it. Imagine being such a joke that China refuses to take you seriously as a concept when you go to Taiwan. It's just astonishing that such a character can be produced. There are a few ways I want to illustrate how unique a position she occupies in public opinion. Really, I could go into it in infinite ways because she's just that special. But there's only so much time we have, and that means I have to focus on some specifics. First, I want to take a look at this graph. First, let's look at some of the more long-lived prime ministers. Here's David Cameron, the politician who was prime minister for the longest time since 2010. Pretty good innings all told, with some choice highlights, including him forming a coalition with the Lib Dems, where they gave him everything he wanted, calling a referendum on EU membership that backfired and resulted in his resignation, and led to the premiership of the next prime minister on the graph. Boris Johnson's column is already a little unimpressive next to Cameron's, and if we look to Theresa May's, which is very similar, these represent some of the more embarrassingly short tenures of prime ministers that were marred by a total inability to circle the square of their party's inherent instability. Which isn't new to the Tories, because the next interesting figure I found in the list of prime ministers who had short terms was the Duke of Wellington. Yes, that one, the one you probably know for defeating Napoleon at Waterloo. It turns out being an adequate general isn't an indication that you'll be a good prime minister. He lasted 1,050 days and was swept out of power after a series of riots and a total refusal to countenance any reform to the political system being proposed. This was around the time when the Great Reform Act was being pushed by the Whigs. I told you there'd be a Napoleon payoff. Then we come to the original embarrassingly short premiership that I can remember, Gordon Brown, who was 2 days short of Theresa May's tenure because she orchestrated her departure to make sure that she wasn't more embarrassing than him. Gordon Brown's misfortune was to follow Tony Blair, who was a war criminal, yes, but also simply locked in the neoliberal consensus. And while it was an American mortgage crisis that detonated the economy, Brown didn't have what it took to win during an economic crisis, which, to be fair, very few do. Also, he totally melted when he correctly called a woman a bigot. Total coward shit on his part. Then we get to Anthony Eden, who resigned for health reasons, but was really toast once he bungled the Suez Crisis. The event which made everyone aware that Britain was not in fact the third superpower in the Cold War, alongside the Soviet Union and America, capable of projecting force in the same way as those two, but was in fact the decaying part of an empire that had deserved to die a long time before that moment. Eden's prize was being swiftly replaced. Then we come to the first one that recorded a term of office under a year long, Alec Douglas Home. Don't really care to say much about him other than that you must be really shit to be a Tory who loses an election to the Labour Party. And of course there's Andrew Bonar Law. Okay, mostly he's been included because of his name, because that's made up, right? We finally made it to the previous shortest serving Prime Minister, George Canning, who I feel bad for because he's only really on this list because he died in office. He made it to 119 days, which if it wasn't for the specific way he left office would be embarrassing. But I'm going to give him a pass. At last, we reach Liz Truss. 49 days. 2 digits. A bar that's barely visible next to Cameron's, Brown's, May's, Johnson's, and even failures like Anthony Eden. She stands alone, an island in the vast ocean. The nearest island to her exists far back in the past. A little-known king of England called Svein Forkbeard, who died in 1014 after being king of England for 5 weeks. This comparison is a little unfair on Svein because he was also the king of Denmark and Norway for 28 and 14 years, respectively. Oh, the lettuce fell. Oh no. You alright? Sorry, the lettuce fell. The next graph I want to draw your attention to is one that shows a monthly average of each major political party's leader since 2010's net approval. I've made this a comparable data set by having each line begin at the same place. Each point represents 1 month from when they entered office. If the leader faced an election and that they resigned in the aftermath of, that's where I cut it off, because the figure ceases to be a relevant political figure, no matter what the British press tell you about that person. The leaders I've charted here are David Cameron, Ed Miliband, Nicola, Sturgeon, Jeremy Corbyn, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, and Liz Truss. So what we see here is a pretty generally disliked set of political leaders. Yeah, Nicola Sturgeon does alright when we have data for her. Of these leaders, even the ones we think of as failures had moments where opinion about them was at least not wholly negative. Hell, some of them started out quite popular. Ed Miliband had a really good net approval at the start of his time as leader of the opposition. Liz Truss is remarkable, not just because the depth of feeling was so strong, but because of the speed at which the British public made up their mind about her. Take Jeremy Corbyn, often cited as a particularly unpopular politician with no real interest as to why or how that happened. Even with him, the British public took a while to make a series of decisions about him. It took 11 months for him to match Liz Truss's starting net approval average, a time that coincided with a really divisive leadership challenge led by Mr. 29 Inches himself, Owen Smith, seen here trying to give away a free ice cream. Yeah, the picture's real. And the funnier part is he was unable to give away free ice cream because that's how unpopular he was. Anyway, back to the graph. Even Jeremy Corbyn, having reached Liz Truss's starting number, rallied from there and broke into positive net approval. At the time, this was unprecedented given the speed of it and its connection to a general election, but it proved that it was possible to rally from such bad numbers. Here's what Liz Truss did. She is once again alone. No comparable leader of her era became that unpopular that quickly. She cannot be beaten, at least not yet. A true icon of a political culture that's become truly debased. A representation of God's displeasure with the very land of Great Britain itself. Here's a thought. Have you ever considered what the absolute peak for a politician's approval might be? Maybe if they perform better than expected in an election, or are just actually good at their job, or maybe the infamous rally round the flag effect because of some kind of event or pandemic. Liz Truss had the ultimate rally round the flag effect happen on her watch. The Queen met her, and then the Queen died. And in fairness, you can't blame her. If I just put Liz Truss in charge of the country, I think it might be time for me to depart the realm of the living too. If we look at this graph, it shows the highest net approval of the same leaders we were looking at before. You'll see Cameron on the left with the highest approval, plus 47, which seems literally unbelievable now, but at the time wasn't that weird, I guess. Corbyn, who was widely regarded as a particularly bad leader, registered a plus 17. His successor Keir Starmer has so far recorded the highest net approval of plus 31. I feel confident that even with an election victory, this will be the highest he gets. Then we look at this little one here, Liz Truss. Even with the rally round the flag effect, she registered a plus 4. Even when she was doing the absolute best she could have been doing, she merely did okay. A honeymoon period, the Queen dying, no chance to do any of her policies, and she still barely clawed above the water. I want to turn our attention to one final set of data. If we accept the adage that all political careers end in failure, which is just about the only thing that Enoch Powell said that I'll ever paraphrase positively. I know it's not going to be a habit I get into, don't worry, I'm not beginning a Powerlight arc. Then Liz Truss was quite a dramatic failure. She took an entirely voluntary action that panicked the markets and caused a lot of chickens that, to be fair to her, were structural long-standing to come home to roost. Unfortunately for Liz Truss, you don't get credit for pointing out that the factors that led to the economic collapse were significantly laid by your predecessors or things outside of your immediate control, especially when you light the fuse yourself that sets them all off at the same time. Just how dramatic was that failure and the way that her career ended, at least for now, don't quote me on this, but I think she might be coming back. Well, let's turn to the final shitposty graph of the video. No, this isn't a mistake. I haven't forgotten to put a bar here. Nicola Sturgeon really did resign with a net approval of 0. Perfectly balanced, as all things should be. Given the numbers we've been dealing with in this video, 0 doesn't look like failure. Common Enoch Powell L, I'd say. Then we have Ed Miliband, who pretty decisively failed, in part due to Nicola Sturgeon's appeal in 2015. But while minus 19 is bad, it's nowhere near his worst rating of his career, or the worst rating on this graph. Then we come to a collection of 4 leaders who perhaps represent a typical level of failure for the mid-late 2010s and 2020s so far, ranging from minus 35 for May to minus 40 for Johnson. Let me be frank, these ratings are bad. But given how generally low the political class in the UK is, and the polarisation that happened, particularly starting from Cameron's second term as Prime Minister, and the EU referendum, plus Johnson's handling of the pandemic, these numbers are a product of a number of factors, some very damaging, and even some that were very long-running, like long-running media campaigns, but I talked about those in another video. With these 4, they were the leaders of their parties for multiple years, which makes Truss's number all the more astounding. Not to flex my education, but this is like looking at how a black hole warps space-time against very massive stars. Liz Truss warped political perception so much that she made every other politician in the country more popular by opposition to her. She was a gift to every single politician on this graph, every single one who will ever follow her, and to the country at large. Who else could truly unify the country as a perfect lightning rod for hatred? Corbyn, May, Johnson, you could argue were at various times unpopular politicians, polarising ones even. There were at least some people who really liked them or their political programmes, even in their darkest days. Liz Truss had nobody. If you're from the UK, you've probably met someone who liked Corbyn, or May, or Johnson, or even Miliband. You've never met someone who liked Liz Truss. If Napoleon was truly finally put away on St. Helena, then Liz Truss exists in a more remote place in our minds. She is truly beyond the political event horizon, with no prospect of return. Her name won't live on. It'll be an answer given at pub quizzes for as long as the format exists. For those of us who remember her, she'll be a figure of fun. All of this makes for a nice story, and a nice shitpost, and that's really all that there is to this video. But one question emerges as I look at all of this. How did she end up there? There's the obvious procedural answer, and that absolutely plays a role. And part of the answer lies in the video I did about why politicians in the UK are so terrible. Liz Truss, however, is so awful that she requires her own bespoke explanation. In STEM subjects, we're taught not to explore anomalies in the data too much, because yeah, something interesting may be happening there, but if it only happens once, there are all sorts of reasons why that might happen. Malfunctions in the equipment being used to measure, bad luck, you didn't calibrate your equipment properly, and found particles that were travelling faster than light, and then the press did a whole thing about it. I actually feel kind of bad for the scientists in that one, because that one wasn't really their fault, and maybe there's a whole video to be done about scientific literacy in the press. But my point is, this video goes against everything I was taught, because Liz Truss is an anomaly. She's the equivalent of those particles flying faster than light. She shouldn't exist, and yet she was there, in front of our eyes. How can we explain this? Firstly, when we look at the policies of Liz Truss, we find a specific address related to them, 55 Tufton Street. An address where a number of think tanks that deny climate change, advocate for low-tax, libertarian-style arrangements in the UK, think tanks that are pro-Brexit and support the oil industry are based. Think tanks that have been platformed by major media outlets and the BBC. This isn't anything new. Being from an organisation of any kind means people are more likely to listen to or platform you. But these shadily funded think tanks, the IEA for example, as far as I'm aware, still refuses to reveal who funds it, were given a disproportionate platform to spew their ideology without being proportionally scrutinised or questioned on their assumptions or even their funding sources. There's a whole video to be done on the UK's think tank problem, but these libertarian, anti-Brexit, climate-denying think tanks created a space in politics for the Liz Trusses of the world to enter the Conservatives Parliamentary Party, largely under David Cameron, who was, like another leader that we might think of, notoriously weak to his party's right flank. Then we have a political media system that's been screaming furiously at anyone who suggests better things are possible that they're not possible. I mean, I did a video about one of the more egregious occasions where this happened, but this has been the general tenor of British politics since probably at least the financial crash. I might argue a little further, but this does a couple of things. It totally delegitimizes the idea of change in the minds of the public because being yelled at by the press, frankly, is not worth it. It also gives license to the right to not just push further right, which they did, but to get pretty weird with it. It's like being an artist that's getting patronage from a king who just throws money at you and doesn't mind what you do. If you're making the most of that opportunity, you'll make the thing that you want to. For some, sadly, the thing that they wanted to make was Liz Truss Prime Minister. Let's also not forget that there was a process by which she won. She first had to navigate the Tory parliamentary party to get into the final two. This is normally touted across the political spectrum and across political lines as a system that means representatives of the electorate who are sensitive to their desires have an appropriate say. For example, if I'm in a marginal seat, I would want someone who's popular in the marginal seats to be the leader of my party. This ignores the fact that the Tory, and let's be real, other parties as well, are full of weird people. And there's nothing wrong with being a weird person with specific interests, but there's a difference between your friend who's really into collecting animals petrified in amber and that friend deciding who should be a candidate for Prime Minister on the basis of their policy of amber petrification. The Tory membership are also really fucking weird. I mean, they elected Liz Truss and now the guy they rejected is Prime Minister, against a lot of their wills. Still, if we're being honest, that's because they've been infiltrated, or as some might say, they've been a victim of entryism, by a variety of right-of Tory organisations, not least UKIP, who absorbed a lot of BNP types. So if you're wondering why the Tories manifesto in 2024 is going to look to the right of the BNPs in 2010, well, here's your answer. The other thing isn't just how she got to be leader, but why she was chucked out. On the one hand, she was obviously incapable of handling the role. On the other, she was thrown out because she threw the markets into turmoil. And however I may feel about all of this, that's probably not a good thing, just generally speaking, or for democracy. Like, wouldn't a socialist who was democratically elected also throw the markets into turmoil? At the risk of this getting too serious, I will say that it was at least funny when it happened to someone else for once. So there's that. Also, not to foreshadow anything, but if the polls are accurate, and recent by-elections are to be taken as an indication, the Tories are heading for a really bad night at the next election. Some seat number predictions show that the most senior Tory left standing might be Liz Truss. The lack of seriousness in our politics and a variety of other factors might mean that Liz Truss does something even Napoleon couldn't. Return from St. Helena. Imagine it. Prime Minister Keir Starmer being grilled by leader of the opposition Liz Truss. Have stranger things happened? Not many, but if this turns out to be accurate, I'm going to be an incredibly smug prick about it. So what did we learn today? That's a really, really good question, because this was just an extended joke that got away from me. This was really my third choice of video to do around Halloween. But I think there are some critical points that we can understand from this, which is that I think from now on, every political leader we have in the UK, for a while, is going to exist in Liz Truss's shadow. And if Rishi Sunak is any indication, they will basically do Liz Truss without Liz Truss. What has Rishi Sunak really changed? Not a whole lot. There's nothing more credible, there's nothing better. It's really going to be the same thing. Even Keir Starmer, when he comes in, he's going to be a Trussist, really. Trussist? Trussite? God, it doesn't bear thinking about. The other thing that I think that we learn, as we always do on this channel, is that the UK is kind of a pointless joke of a place, filled with pointless jokes of people. And that filters up to the very top. The more of a pointless joke you are, the better your chance of being at the very top, which is a bit disheartening when you think about it. And I think the other takeaway is that sometimes, somehow, it is possible to be a right-winger who's not taken seriously by British public opinion or by the people who seek to influence that opinion. It just took being Liz Truss for that to happen. And I guess the other thing we found out is that I'm really into, like, extreme data profiles for politicians. And maybe that I think that Liz Truss is coming back. Brace yourselves. The Liz Truss comeback, baby. It's on. Now, I need to thank my partner who proofread the script. I need to thank Emma who did the thumbnail for this. It's a banger. As always, go commission him. I said I was going to push him more. Go commission him. Details in the description. I also need to tell you all, like, subscribe, share the video, all of the good stuff. Definitely share this one because I think it's a really fun one. At least it was fun for me to write. Also, like, apologies if I sounded nasally or a bit unwell. It's because I'm nasally and a bit unwell. There's no real way around explaining that, I'm afraid. And I also need to thank my patrons, particularly the top tier patrons, Drone Riff, Mercutio, Kazushida, John N. Thank you very much to them. Also, there is now a Ko-fi for you to tip me in some fashion if you feel so inclined but don't want to use Patreon for whatever reason. That exists. And I also need to thank Liz Truss for appearing in the video. It was very, very kind of her to make an appearance in a video that was so critical of her career. I really appreciated that she took the time, out of her busy schedule, stealing hotel towels and going to Taiwan and not making the Chinese angry. This is really annoying because I'm not sure what I'm going to do with this lettuce. We PVA glued the eyes on, and so I don't know if we can like eat that still. We're gonna figure out. We're gonna figure out. So with that, everyone, take it easy. See you on the next one. Have a good Halloween. Maybe put in the comments what you're going as for Halloween. That'll be kind of fun. And don't say you're going as the Liz Truss lettuce, because that is my costume. You cannot steal it. Okay? Right. Bye.